Greetings. Welcome to a discussion on the Ten Commandments as a political theology. Today I would like to begin our discussion with a single verse from the New Testament, which on one level has nothing to do with the commandments and on another level has everything to do with the commandments. The verse that I would like to share with you today is from 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. And the verse reads, "Conduct yourself honorably among the Gentiles, so that, though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when He comes to judge." The first century church and the church for the last 2,000 years know that people are watching. They know that people outside the church are watching to see how the church behaves and whether that behavior matches what it preaches. And so Peter, or the writer of this letter, probably in the late first century, says to the church, act honorably, do good things, be careful to care for your neighbor. And your neighbors and society will watch and they will know that you worship a God and that God is with you in this world by your very behaviors. Now I say this before we study the commandments because if we as God's people, as a church, follow the commandments, we, like those in the first century, know that people are watching to see who we are, what we preach, and do we believe and follow what we preach. Or in terms of this presentation, if we proclaim the commandments are the way that we live our life, do we follow them? And if we follow them, then we are an honest people and we have integrity. Now let's turn to the commandments. Today we are going to look at two commandments. The first commandment that we are going to discuss is going to be, you shall make no wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Notice it is written on the first tablet, which means its primary purpose is to talk about our relationship with God and that relationship, how it reflects in our spiritual life. The second commandment is, neither shall you bear false witness against your neighbor. Notice the commandment is on the second tablet. And the second tablet describes the behaviors that exist between God's people, between the individuals who call themselves members or a part of God's people. In my thinking, these two commandments address the same issue, the issue of honest and integrity. And since they bear the same interest and address the same subject, they ought to be yoked. And so in this presentation and in my thinking, I yoke together. We are not to use God's name wrongfully, nor are we to bear false witness against our neighbor. We will discuss the commandments one and then the other. The first commandment that we are going to discuss is, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Understanding this commandment, I think, is dependent upon understanding how we interpret the word name. In ancient Israel, name was the equivalent with a person or with a god. And if a person called upon a god by name or an individual by name when making a statement. The individual was saying, this God, this person will verify everything that I am saying as being true. They will confirm my interpretation of an event. They will say, that's exactly what has happened. It is as if God comes and stands next to the individual and verifies everything the individual says. Now, that being said, biblical scholars maintain that this commandment's original use was in the law court. It was to make sure the law courts were honest and that they had integrity. And so what this commandment says was, when an individual comes to be a witness in the law court, to testify, and the individual swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, the individual is standing there, and when he or she says, by the help of God, God is right here with me in the witness chair. And God will tell you everything that I say is absolutely true. There is a reason why witnesses had to take this oath. It was to guarantee the integrity and the honesty of the courts. In ancient Israel, the people knew that God was present in their midst, that God would protect them, that God would bless them, that God would give them abundant life when the legal system had integrity. When the legal system guaranteed that all people, and especially those with little status or economic means, would get a fair trial. And the trial could not be manipulated by false statement or false testimony. And so they instituted this commandment. You shall not use the Lord's name wrongly, testify wrongly, support a lie on the stand in order to get personal gain. This commandment was meant to provide integrity and honesty to a legal system. Now the reformers added and expanded the commandment. Oh, they had no trouble with it being a commandment for the law court. But they added that if we are to be honest in the law court, we ought to be honest in every other area of life. So the commandment was expanded to include economics, business dealings. That in business you had to tell the truth. You could not tell a lie. You had to represent products honestly and fairly. You would never point to something and say it was good when it wasn't good. And in all other personal dealings, honesty, integrity was the most important thing that God's people could do. And so for the reformers, the commandment which we are all taught in our confirmation classes deals with not lying on the stand and being honest in all of our dealings with other people. And if we don't do that, the reformers would tell us, and the Old Testament would tell us, we are using the Lord's name wrongfully. Now the question arises, what does this mean in the 21st century? How do we see this commandment playing out? What does it mean for God's people, God's church, a congregation? How do we maintain the reputation that we are an honest people and we have integrity? Well, let me share one way to do it. God's people are honest when they claim to be something, and they are actually what they claim to be. We claim to be loving. We claim to be forgiving. We claim to care about people, the something. And when we are loving and we are caring for people, because that's what we say, then our words are honest. And if we don't do that, then, in the words of the commandment, we are using God's name wrongfully. There was a book written, The Leadership Challenge, in the very late 1990s. And in that book, and then a following audio tape about the book, the authors stated very plainly that followers have expectations for their leaders. And I would add, followers have expectations for the company or the organization or the church for which they worked. And if the leaders and managers of the company met these expectations, the leaders were honest, and they had integrity, and they were characterized as being good. But if they didn't follow or meet these expectations, leaders were questionable, perhaps dishonest, perhaps lacking integrity. And there was some problems within the organization. Now, I would like to suggest that the list in the book, The Leadership Challenge, is a list that members look at their congregation and say, we are an honest people if we do these things. I would also suggest that people outside the church probably have about the same list and look to see if the church matches their expectations. And if we match the expectations of members and outside on this list, then we have the reputation for being honest. And we have the reputation for integrity. So let me go through that list with you. There are 6 items on the list. And the first item is, we expect the church, we expect the leaders of the church, we expect God's people to be honest. Now, very quickly, that means there's accuracy in reports. There's accuracy when we describe the ministries of the church. There's accuracy when we measure the assets of the church, especially financial assets. And there's honesty when the leaders share their perception of what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of the church. But on a deeper level, honesty can also mean what we say is what we do. This is often a characteristic of God. What God says, God will do. For example, I think God has said over and over and over again in the scriptures, even though my people rebel against me and don't always do what I ask them to do, or don't always meet my expectations, I will still love them and I will restore the relationship. I think of the 37th chapter of Ezekiel in the famous story of the dry bones. The dry bones are Israel being dead in the Babylonian captivity. And God comes and brings the bones together and puts sinew on them and breathes into them. And Israel lives. God is honest, because when God said, I will restore, even though you rebel, God restored, even though Israel rebelled. When a church claims to be honest, if it is honest, it has honesty and integrity as a reputation. And if it isn't honest, there's real questions about its integrity by members and non-members alike. And I would add, even God has questions. The second item is competency. Now here, competency means to look below the surface to see what is happening. Not just to go put band-aids on issues that are occurring around us or just dealing with the latest fad, but what's going on? What is causing the issue? Why is this happening? And when we know what is causing the issue and what is happening, then we deal with the cause and not just the surface issue that sometimes we put a band-aid on. For honesty, integrity to exist among God's people, if they say they're competent, then they must be people always looking for the why instead of just a surface issue, and then doing things to reduce the why so the pain and the challenge goes away. Third, vision. Followers, church members, society looks to the church to see what its vision is. And if a church says it has a vision, it better be living out that vision. Doing what the vision says we're going to be like in 5 years or 10 years from now. Visions for God's people often include we're going to treat every member and everyone we meet as if they are a child of God, with dignity and respect. We are going to become an instrument of peace in our community. And we're going to be a place where people with different backgrounds and different needs and even different ways of thinking about the world can gather in safety and knowing that they can speak their mind without being hated. Vision is extremely important. It's the glue that holds us together. And so if we say, we have a vision, and part of that vision is God's kingdom here and now in this world, we only have honesty and integrity if we're working on achieving that vision. The fourth characteristic is to inspire, inspiring. Now, how this is interpreted is God's vision is shared in such a way that others want to come and adopt it as their own. That bringing about God's kingdom here on earth, about living in peace and harmony, and about sharing, about making the world a better place in Jesus' name is just exciting. Turns us on. Gives God's people a reason and a purpose in which to exist and live. If we say we are a people of vision, we better be a people of vision. The fifth expectation is cooperation. God's people work together cooperatively. There was a layperson back in the 1970s, perhaps early 80s. I can't remember his name. He was a steel executive for one of the very large steel companies. He was also a very strong lay leader in the Lutheran Church. He had a lot of fun challenging pastors. He would ask pastors, so tell me about your theology of competition. And if many pastors would immediately think of Paul, and I compete for the race, and I run, and I'm going to get to heaven, and all of that. And then the leader would say, in the Bible, there is no theology of competition. There is only a theology of cooperation, where we work together, where we applaud each other's gifts and not try to be like them. When they succeed, we celebrate. When they fail, we do not rub it in or tease about the failing. We talk a lot about God's kingdom of being a kingdom of cooperation. We have honesty and integrity when we actually live it. And the final expectation was dependability. Dependability is stability. We're here for the long haul. In some ways it says when you're looking for honest people, we are the honest people. We're dependable. We meet this need or competency or to go to visioning and inspiring. You can count on us because this is who we are. We are dependable. Now when we look at this commandment that says we are not to use God's name wrongly, and whenever we're doing anything in God's kingdom to build for that kingdom, we better do what we say that we do, because the rest of the world is watching. Now let's look at the other commandment we're going to discuss today. And the other commandment is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. I said at the very beginning that this commandment was also about honesty and integrity. When I studied what the reformers in the 15th century, the Protestant reformers, had to say about this commandment, they listed 5 behaviors about what is not bearing false witness against your neighbor. And I'd like to share those 5 characteristics. We may call them attributes. The first one, no charges to the authorities, to the people who have oversight over us. No false charges. Sounds very much like no false testimony. We don't go and say so-and-so did, and when they didn't do it, we don't go say so-and-so didn't do when they did do. We don't suggest, if it doesn't happen, that somehow someone else is guilty, and especially if they're guilty, to take the blame for something that we did. And the second one the reformers talk about is only truthful communications. This means no disinformation, no twisting the truths, no half-truths, no lies. That among God's people there is no tolerance for lying or cheating or disinformation or twisting the facts so that I can get my way. And again, this sounds very much like the commandment not to use God's name wrongfully. Then there are 3 more. And these take, at least for my mind, a different flavor. The third one is no slander. Slander is conversation or images or writing or speaking that just tears somebody else down. My conversation is primarily to destroy somebody else, or to destroy a relationship, or to destroy an effort. we are not to go about slandering people, giving very negative interpretations for what they did or for what they do. It's very hard to write laws about slanders, where it's not so hard to write laws about other things like disinformation or bending the truth. So the Reformers said this ought to really be a part of not bearing false witness against your neighbor. Then they said no gossip. Now this, I think, means no bad, evil gossip, spreading rumors, keeping a lie going, keeping disinformation, misleading information, twisting the facts to fit a personal purpose. This kind of gossip is just forbidden if we take this commandment seriously and the teachings of the Protestant Church today. And finally, the Reformers said that we are to give the most charitable characterization of our neighbor as is possible. For example, if the neighbor messes up just a little bit, we might very much say, I think he was trying something that was meant to be good, it just didn't work out that way. Or I think his motives were fine. Or I think she was really trying to help. How do we frame what our neighbor does? And is that frame meant to be supportive or loving or forgiving, or is it meant to be destructive? And so, not having false witness against your neighbor, really, in these last three especially, is much more personal behavior. But they also become the standards and the core values of a collected people, and this kind of behavior is simply not tolerated. Now I want to say one thing more. I want to talk about partnerships between congregations. Many congregations, especially smaller congregations, yoke together to meet a community need or to meet a similar need in both congregations. And when I look at the commandment that you shall not use God's name in vain, that you are to be honest, and that you are to have integrity, that means what you agree to, either by a strong verbal agreement or by written contract. What you say you will do in that partnership, in that agreement, you actually do. And I think it's very clear for both congregations, because there's going to be some times when you bump into each other, that we're not going to backbite, we're not going to spread gossip, we're not going to slander the other. And if these two commandments are kept in that partnership, the potential is very high the partnership will be harmonious and fruitful. Before we leave, before we go off to do our own thing, I want to raise some questions with you. So the conversation continues. And the questions are what were the surprises in this? Is it a surprise that you can yoke two commandments together? Is it a surprise that the commandment not to bear false witness was basically perjury? Against perjury? Was it a surprise what the Reformers add to it? If there are any new insights, what were they? Did you get to see the Bible from a different perspective? A biblical text that you didn't understand before suddenly makes sense. Were there new insights about the history of the Bible and exactly what name meant in the ancient world? If there were statements that you want to challenge, what were they? I'm not sure that gossip is a part of the commandment. Or I'm not sure that we really always need to have charitable characterizations of what our neighbor is doing. And finally, what is one thing that you would want to tell a friend, a neighbor, a Bible study companion that's not watching with you today? What happened here? Thank you for being here today. I look forward to being with you again next time.